Okay, welcome back. So today I'm going to go over chapter 3 from the Intro to Data Visualization by Healy. And what I'll do today is go through how to build these plots in R. The book does a great job of talking about the kind of ideas behind ggplot and how you build with layers. So rather than focus on that, I'm going to show you how to work with the code, since that's usually the hardest part to understand. So to start off, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So what you'll notice is as we go through here, we're going to start by making our file and begin working with tidyverse. So I'm going to go ahead and create a file over here using the R Markdown. And I'm going to call this homework, or sorry, chapter 3 homework. Okay. And within this, I'll go ahead and add a new line here. And you'll notice it's got my title, my name, and these first chunks. This is a kind of template that you can build off of. So what we're going to do is just kind of follow along. I usually get rid of this text to begin with, since it's related to something else. And then I usually empty out these chunks and rename them as I go along. So you can do the same. Just make sure that you're saving this all in your workspace. And the easiest way to do that is go find your working directory where you're working and go ahead and say set as working directory. And that should just save things in the same place. And it'd be good at this point to save the file in that same folder. So I'll call this homework, or chapter 3 homework. Okay, so I'm going to save it there and I'll get started. So the plots work in a really interesting way. You have to specify the data you're working with, and then you map things like the aesthetics that you're working with and the colors. And then using a geom, you change this into kind of an ink on the page. Then you add your scales and your labels and extra titles and things like that. So we're going to do the same thing today. We're going to be working with the data set from Gapminder. So the first thing we want to do is load our packages. So we want to do library tidyverse and library. I think there's a second package we're going to need down here called library Gapminder. So we're going to load library Gapminder. Okay, and hopefully we run these and they load. If they don't load, you may need to install these packages. So to install the package, go to the packages tab and then hit install. And then here you should be able to find tidyverse and install there. And then you can also do the same thing for Gapminder if it's not already loading. Okay, good. So I'm going to hide this again since we don't need the console right now. So we have our Gapminder package loading. This should bring up the data set, and we can go ahead and look at this data set in this first chunk. So I'm going to rename this Gapminder. And what I'm going to do inside this chunk is type out Gapminder. And this is a table that comes with the package, and it should give me the same information here. As you can see, there's lots of rows on each country, their year and life expectancy, as well as some other data. So this is really useful because this is a long data set, which works really well with the tidy packages that we're going to be working with today. So to start off, let's go with this ggplot function. So I'm going to rename, instead of our markdown, I'm going to say my first figure of the Gapminder data. Okay, so now this is going to be a header when we go to knit it. And what we're going to do with this is store this as one of the arguments inside the ggplot. So we're going to create a new object called P. And what does P do? P is going to bring up the ggplot for the data that we specify. So the first argument is data equals gapminder, comma. I'm going to do a new line just so I can kind of keep my arguments separated. So after the comma, I do new line. Then I'm going to say the second argument is mapping equals AES. That's short for aesthetics. So this function is going to map our aesthetics. And the first one is X. So we have to say what X is going to be. This is going to be GDP per cap, which is the GDP per capita. And then the second one is going to be Y equals life expectancy, a life EXP. So this alone should store this as an object called P, and you'll notice my environment got updated, and now I can see there's lots of layers to this object named P. This is pretty typical of a ggplot. Now, on its own, P is really not going to do anything. So if we try and type P in the console, and we want to view what P does, we're going to get a little plot. Oh, I misspelled GDP per capita. Okay, so I'll run that chunk again, and then I'll type P again. You'll notice that this plot doesn't have any ink on the page. It's just going to give me the pre-formatted axes, the plot space, and some labels based upon the categories I assigned to as variables. So ggplot needs to build in layers, and so far we don't have the ink layer. So let's go ahead and add that with this geom point. So what I'm going to do is create a new line so you can kind of see how each layer gets added on. I'm going to say P plus geom point. Now, sometimes you might want to specify X and Y within this, but since it's already specified in this top function, we don't need it for the second one. Now I'm going to go ahead and run this. And as you can see, let's see what happens. I run that single line. Now I have some ink on the page, and it works great. I get a nice view. I can see each of the dots. So we're going to call this gapminder 3.4 based upon the figure. Now, what I'm going to do is create multiple chunks so that I can kind of show you step by step what each of these things look like. But for your assignment, you only have to do the one that is necessary for this task. So let's go ahead and working on additional figures. So I'm going to, again, kind of remove some of the template here so that I can keep working down below. So now we can build it layer by layer. And it's going to explain some of the things that the functions do. All right, so here's our next one. We're going to do figure 3.5. So it looks like I'm going to do the same things. I'm going to have P. So I can do this by copying and pasting what I had before. It's a good habit to especially when you're learning to type everything out. But in the interest of time in the video, I'm going to be copying and pasting. Okay, so now I have a new function called geom smooth. What this is going to do is create this nice trend line that would go over where the points are. So you can kind of see what the general shape of the trend is. And that's quite useful. What's cool about this is I can actually layer these two. So if I want to do figure, I'm going to copy this whole chunk and create a new one down here. Let's do figure 3.6. Let's say I want to combine these two layers. So I'm going to add geom point in the middle here, point. And I'm going to add my geom smooth. So now I have a second layer, and now I have both the ink from the scatter plot and the blue from the trend line. So this is looking really good. Now I can start to see some shapes. And you might get some warnings like geom smooth using GAM and formula. This is just making assumptions about what kind of linear model or non-linear model you want to use to map the data. So if instead we wanted to use a straight line, that's what this LM is, we'd have to add an argument to that. So let's do that for figure 3.7. So same thing. Make sure you're renaming these chunks as you go along, otherwise you won't be able to knit them. You'll get errors. They should each have a unique name. So now we're going to call this method equals, so this is a new argument, and the method is named LM. So we're going to put that in quotes. And it's going to give us a straight line. So that's our linear model. And as you can see, it looks like, you know, if your GDP goes way up, theoretically, you should be living a lot longer, but that doesn't happen across the countries. Now, one thing that's kind of odd about this is all the data is grouped up. It's kind of bunched together. It's hard to see individual points. And so one way we can kind of correct that is by putting it on a log scale. A log scale builds off of powers of 10 rather than going up incrementally. So to do that, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to have our geom point, and then I'm going to do a new line after that, and then geom smooth. And then now we're going to specify the scale. So this is like the fourth layer that we'd want to kind of build into it. And when we run the scale, now you can see we get this nice spread out data. Although the axes look kind of weird, this is hard for a lot of people to read, this kind of notation, but it's saying the same thing that the other one had before. So that was figure 3.8. So let's keep going. How about figure 3.9? So as you can see, we're kind of building layer by layer. This one looks like I changed the axes so that it's a little more easy to read and in a familiar format. So we're going to say inside the scales argument for the x-axis, we're going to say labels equal scales : dollars. Great. Now let's go ahead and run this. And as you can see, our scales got updated at the bottom. This is great. Okay, and along the way, I'm going to save just so my work doesn't get lost. Okay, so the next thing is it looks like we have to add some color to this. Notice that in this case, it's prescribed the color as purple, and it changed the method here. So what went wrong here? Well, we don't want the color to look like this. We want it to actually be the color purple. So what you can see is that there's some changes here. And to just kind of demonstrate, again, I'll take my figure 3.9, and then I'll go down below, create a few new lines. So figure 3.10. Now we're going to do the same thing, except we had this new line called color equals quote purple. So what it's looking for is a variable here. And instead of getting a variable, it's just getting the characters purple. It looks like they changed the smooth method too. And as you can see, we'll get the same kind of effect here. So what we want to do instead is change the color to be purple. So we're going to try this again down below, create a new chunk. I'm going to save this. It's going to be 3.11. And now we're going to specify the color for the geom point rather than as an aesthetic that is being mapped. So some subtleties in how those arguments are written, but they do make a big difference. Okay, so that looks a lot better. And now this is a property of the point rather than being a property of the data in the ggplot. So that's figure 3.11. We'll keep going. Let's try 3.12. Okay, so this time now it's getting rid of the um, standard error. So you notice there's no gray bar around here showing the uncertainty around the trend line. And we also see that the points are kind of faded a little bit, so you can see where there's density or not. So to change the density, we're going to change it to alpha. So let's get rid of the purple. Alpha is a way to measure how transparent color is. So alpha equals 0.3. That should make it a little easier to see through. And then for our geom smooth, we're going to fill this in with some extra information. So first we're going to do color equals quote orange. So that should make the line orange. SE equals false. So that removes the error bars or the shaded area. Then we can increase the size to 8. And let's see what method they use here, LM. So that's how they got the straight line. So they're using a linear model specified by the characters LM. Okay, so we'll go ahead and run this. Hey, that looks pretty close. Looks like they removed the labels. I like that though. Notice how you can kind of see the overlap of the points better. All right, so let's keep chugging along. So here is the more polished version that we want to work with. And so we're going to call this figure 1 or 3.13. And as you'll notice, the nice thing about this is even though we have these color scales and stuff, the better thing about this is there's titles and the labels are now written out so they don't look like variables anymore. So let's first remove all this extra stuff that was on the smooth, and we'll go back to the method being GAM. And for our scales, we're going to keep that as dollars, but now we're going to add our fifth layer, the labels. Okay, so for this, we use a function labs for the labels. And first, we're going to specify the argument for X. X axis is going to be quote GDP per capita. And I'm going to get rid of those spaces. And then I'm going to do comma, and then I'll put a new line just so I keep my arguments separated. So here we do quote life expectancy in years. All right, and then we'll do a new line. Title equals economic growth and life expectancy. So that'll give us a nice title. And it looks like there's a caption here too, so we can cite our source. Source is Gapminder, period. Okay, so this should have enough that we can make this nice polished graph now. And look at that, pretty cool. Since I think there's some kind of mistake in their drawing, it should probably be an LM since it's a straight line. Let's try that again. Yeah, so that looks a little more accurate. For this assignment, you can use either. Okay, so there's some extra things that we can do, and I'll just run through those really quick. So let's imagine we're using the same figure, and we want to add some color for each of the continents, which is, of course, another variable. So we're going to put that in the mapping aesthetics. Color equals continent. And that should pull up from the data set. And it looks like it wants to change the smooth back to los. Okay, very cool. Now it looks like the fading alpha is not useful in this case because now the colors kind of distinguish things a little better. All right. So that's looking good. We'll go ahead and do the next thing. As you can see, it starts to get longer and longer just by adding more and more layers. So this also has a fill, which will help the lines look a little better. So I'm going to do comma, new argument called fill. Fill also uses color, but instead of the borders, it focuses more on what's inside. So hopefully you can see that this is a little different. Whereas this one, the error bars are a different color. And it also, notice that it updates the key as we do all of this. Okay, and then it looks like we got one more that does the same thing, but instead of having all of the different lines best fit, we're just going to focus on the main one here. One big trend line. So to do that, we're going to have to get rid of these fills. And instead, what we're going to do is put those aesthetics with our point. So I'm going to copy those out and paste them into geopoint, but I need to also add the argument AES, and then of course close off brackets. And I also need to say this is mapping. So now geopoint mapping equals AES color equals continent fill equals continent. So now the points should all have, oh, I need another parentheses there. So the points should all have different colors, but since there's no color in this top layer, the geom smooth will just make one. And let's see if that works. There we go. So that's really nice. Kind of a colorful mosaic of countries there. Okay, and of course you can layer on extra information too. So imagine we want to, incorporate some information about their population. Okay, so for this last one, you'll get to see we can add an extra layer and make the color something from a variable as well. So for this 3.17, what we're going to do is specify that we want to add this extra mapping for the log of the population. And what that will do is help add some more information into, essentially each time you're adding new layers like this, you're adding another dimension of the data that can be visualized. So let's see if this works. Yeah, it did work. So this helps to kind of show, what population distribution looks like for these different countries. So I'm going to go ahead and save this. Now, to finish up the assignment, again, you only need to go as far as this one here. But I'm going to knit this, and hopefully it doesn't give me any errors. If it does, it's probably because I have the same name for two different codes chunks. And voila, here we go. I have my report of all of my graphs that I made and the code that was used to make them. So this is what you would turn in. In order to turn it in, it's going to be in your file folder. You'll notice right where you save our markdown, there'll be a new file here. And even if I refresh this, you'll see it collapses to only one. So that's how you do chapter 3 homework. And hopefully you get a little more familiar with how coding in the ggplot works.